So what if I told you that there was a fighter in MMA who had flashy striking, throwing rolling thunders, spinning wheel kicks, insane submission skills like flying triangles, scissor sweep heel hooks, insane lightning fast back takes, had a decorated wrestling background, had electrifying walkouts with sometimes 30 choreographed dancers, multiple wins in both the UFC and K1 kickboxing, and then later in his life became a musician, an author, an actor, and even a member of his country's parliament. You'd probably think I was making shit up, but I'm not. The fighter I'm talking about, and the fighter that's going to be the topic of today's discussion, is who might just be the most interesting man in MMA history, Genki Sudo. From his walkouts to his fighting style to his philosophy and works outside of the cage, Genki might just be one of the most interesting men in MMA history. He started off wrestling as a young man, and on a whim at 18 decided to sign up for his first MMA fight. He went on to have wins over some great names in the sport, guys like Nate Marquardt, Mike Brown, who's now, the famous coach of American Top Team, Tiki Gosen, Hoyler Gracie, Damasio Page, and even heavyweight boxer Butterbean. The fights Genki put on were incredibly exciting, often playing to the crowd and trying to entertain the fans more than anything else. He would throw up spinning wheel kicks, flying triangles, insane judo throws, and spinning back fists, electrifying the crowd in every phase of the fight. He'd often start the fight in strange stances, taking wide, pronounced, stances and walking backwards in the ring, even dancing at some points, hitting the robot or pop locking against his opponent. And you couple this with his genuinely scary power in his hands and his very, very deep knowledge of grappling and submissions, Genki was one of the most terrifying and difficult opponents to face. But before you reach all that trouble that you'd face him in the ring with, you had to sit through his incredibly over-the-top walkouts. He often walked out with a choreographed dancing group, ironclad in costumes or themed outfits. Genki Sudo's walkout routines might be the most interesting part of his personality. One walkout, he was a baseball pitcher surrounded by cheerleaders who spelled out love with their pom-poms, and they had peace written across their chests on their uniforms. And another walkout, he was an air traffic conductor, decked out in reflective gear, and leading the walk down the runway to the fight. And another one, he's a biker in a biker gang. Another one, he's a tribal hunter with this insane ornate headpiece. And another one, he's a geisha. And another one, he's a samurai. All different kinds of walkouts and costumes and everything that he would come out with to entertain the fans before the incredibly entertaining fight that he'd put on. The level of coordination and practice it must have taken to train a group of dancers among the midst of a training camp is nothing to sniff at. It must have taken a lot of practice. It must have taken months of coordination and months of, synchronized dancing and choreography, or choreography, I should say, in order to get this group up to that point. And at the same time, he's training to fight a world-class fighter in a sport where he could get killed, or could get seriously hurt. So the dude is absolutely crazy. And being in the crowd for one of his fights must have been incredible. Between the walkouts and the crazy fighting style, he was definitely going to leave you entertained by the final bell. Once that bell did ring, the final bell, Genki would pull out this banner that was covered in every nation's flag, or at least most nations' flags, and had a very clear and profound message written across it. It said, "We are all one," in big caps. Sudo was asked about this in a documentary that was produced on him about 15 years ago, and this is what he said.
この全ては一つっていうのは僕は真実だと思っているので、結局この世の争いやいろいろな問題というのは結局お互いバラバラだっていうふうに考えているから、今の現状の世界であって、全てが一つって思えば今目の前にいるのは自分自身になるんですよね。他者っていうのは存在しなくなる。そうすれば目の前にいる人が自分だと思ったら、自分に対してどうするかということは、自分に対しては優しくするだろうし、チャンスを与えるだろうし、助けてあげる。
Genki was also asked about his mindset when he initially started fighting and how it changed over the years. He said, "I was filled with greed, or I really just wanted to get to the top. In either case, I wanted to get to the top where I was sure I'd find a wonderful place. But the higher you go, the more suffocating it is, like thin air." It's just an incredible quote, talking about how, he wanted to get to the top. He had this greed to succeed, but he found out that, the more success you get, the more challenging life is, and the more, more money, more problems, pretty much, essentially, is what Genki's saying there. He enjoyed a successful fighting career. He amassed a 16-4-1 record over 10 years and retired at the young age of 28. He also had a stint in kickboxing and even did some submission grappling where he would grapple former UFC heavyweight tournament champion and future UFC light heavyweight champion Vitor Belfort, a guy who was massive compared to Genki. He was about 200 pounds and 6 foot versus Genki's 5'9" and 150. As a lightweight fighter, Genki was clearly never afraid of a challenge or larger adversary, and no adversary was larger than his opponent at K1 Dynamite 2003, Butterbean. Butterbean is a behemoth of a man. He's 5'11" and 270 pounds, and that night he made his professional MMA debut against Genki Sudo. Genki was about 5'9" and 160 pounds versus Butterbean, who had 100 pounds on him and a couple inches of height. In that fight, Genki floated around the ring, kind of taking similar to the style of Manoa Man versus any of these huge guys that he'd fight, except he was fighting a guy who actually knew how to fight in Butterbean, somebody who had 80-plus professional boxing matches before this professional MMA debut. So we're not talking about a sumo wrestler or somebody who's just really fat. We're talking about somebody who really knows how to throw punches and knocks people out regularly. So Genki would float around the ring in that fight. He'd throw up jumping kicks to the knee of Butterbean and run away whenever the monster tried to come back at him with punches. He ended up submitting Butterbean with a heel hook in the second round and handing Butterbean his first submission loss in MMA and his first loss in general in MMA, and just his 10th loss across any combat sport, where he, like I said, he had 80 wins across boxing and kickboxing. Submitting Butterbean was no easy feat, and the American would go on to fight MMA for several years after this debut against Sudo, so it wasn't just like a one-off for him. He ended up having like a 20 or 30 fight career. But seeing Genki fight such a smart and entertaining fight against a monster like Butterbean was just nothing short of incredible. After that, he fought for a few years, trading wins and losses, but mostly wins, ending up that career at 16-4-1. For his final fight against Damasio Page in K1 Dynamite 2006, he probably had his most insane walkout there. He comes out with, again, this big choreographed dance group of 20 or 30 people, and they're all wearing like tribal masks and like hunter gear, essentially. Genki has this huge ornate headdress, very, Native American-esque, and they are lifting him on this platform as if he's the king, and he comes down and they do this like insane choreographed thing with their hands where he's like going like this and all the hands are coming around him, and it's just incredible. It's beautiful. It's really interesting. He had this insane walkout where he takes off the mask and his face is like dead ass the whole time. It's incredible. It's so entertaining to watch. And then he'd do that, famous thing where he rolls out his wrists like this and the whole crowd's getting behind him. When he had that fight with Damasio Page ended up being a great MMA fighter in his own right, had some great wins over his career. And in that fight, he kind of saw through the bullshit of Genki. He didn't let him do his like weird stance switches and crazy movements in the cage. He pressed him immediately. And ended up getting top position against Genki Sudo. And then when he was on the bottom, Genki threw up a triangle and finished him there in that first round, about 3 minutes in. After the fight, Genki, who's 28 years old and, again, one of the most entertaining guys in the sport at the time, he announced his retirement there in the ring, and was much to the shock of everybody else. So, being only 28 years old and one of the most entertaining fighters in the sport, it was pretty jarring to see him leave on a win like that. But Genki had his eyes on bigger and better things in MMA. He used the sport mostly as a platform to get his message out, the message of unity. bookmarked by that common theme. You know, the flag that he would wear that says "We are all one" and everything like that. It was pretty clear what he stood for. It was what he'd preach in his interviews. It's what he wrote about in his philosophical works after retirement. He wrote about 15 philosophical works, all mostly about unity and love and peace. And eventually that was the platform that he'd run for political office on. Genki Sudo would be elected to the equivalent of Japanese parliament in 2019, 13 years after his MMA retirement. And in that 13-year span, he went and did a bunch of side quests, honestly. The dude built an organized dance troupe called World Order. It was also a band where he was the lead singer. There was a lot of the people that he would do these walkouts with. They joined him for the group World Order, and they made a bunch of different videos and music videos and flash mob routines and stuff like that. He published 15 works on philosophy and mindset. He acted in several movies and TV shows in Japan. He lived a bunch of different lives. One as a fighter, one as an entertainer or musician, one as a philosopher, one as an actor, and now he embarked on social change and reform. He held that office as a Japanese parliament member, and he still holds that office since 2019. And he represents a center-left political party in Japan, one that runs on the ideas of abortion access and equal rights for all. Would probably be considered pretty liberal in America, but still relatively center in Japan. Yeah, I mean, just an incredible career, an incredible man, you know, a Renaissance man of all shapes and sizes, whichever way you want to cut it. Genki's worn so many hats in his life, and I don't just mean in the walkouts that he had. He had that of an MMA fighter, of a philosopher, of a musician, of a dancer, an actor, an author, an artist, even that of a politician. The guy's done all the side quests and then some. He's an absolute legend of the sport, and rightfully should go down as the most interesting man in MMA history. Thank you so much for listening. Go check out some Genki Sudo highlights on YouTube. Go check out some of his entrances. Go check out some of his fights. The dude has had some incredible performances in the octagon. Just an incredible man, and I'm just so happy to be able to talk about his life and his story on this podcast. And I thank you so much for listening, y'all. And I appreciate y'all.